Today on Mr. All the Things' latest therapeutic exercise masquerading as a video essay, we're going to talk about Destiny 2 Lightfall and why it's disappointing. I've never talked about Destiny 2 in depth. I referenced it once as an innovative story that advances the medium with its seasonal model, which is an opinion I have soured on a little since then. Even before Lightfall, the story can be a little repetitive and relies too heavily on the typical repetitive grind. In fact, most of my criticisms of Destiny are that there are a lot of weird design decisions that make the game exceedingly tedious. This is annoying because if it didn't have those, this would easily be a great game. With Lightfall, my hope was that they would take the lessons that they had learned from the Witch Queen and apply them and expand on them in this expansion, trimming a lot of the tedium from the game and expanding the story and gameplay, but that didn't happen. So let's take a deep dive, or at least deeper than I normally do, into the many questionable design and narrative decisions made in Destiny 2 Lightfall. Okay, so in the lead up to Lightfall, there are 5 pillars, or I guess criticisms of Destiny, that needed to be addressed in this expansion. Number 1, expand the gameplay and add more mobility to the Guardians. Number 2, introduce new and varied environments with unique activities. 3, fix tedious UI and progression aspects. Number 4, create fun encounters and engaging levels following the model of Witch Queen, which had excellent mission design. And number 5, create an engaging story that adequately answers mysteries set up for this expansion and effectively builds up the threat of the Witness for the final shape. These are not difficult pillars to meet. Hell, I'd say previous expansions, such as the Witch Queen, managed to do a good job of hitting most of them with the addition of the glaive and weapon crafting, the engaging environment that is the Throne World, and crafting a well-paced story with 8 fully fleshed out and fun missions. These are not criteria Bungie is incapable of meeting, and yet they didn't meet any of them with Lightfall, not fully anyway. Oh sure, there are elements of this expansion that meet these criteria, but of these 5, the only one I think that they met in any adequate way was the first one, and even then that comes with a little asterisk. So we might as well start there. How does Lightfall manage to meet the expectations surrounding gameplay, and how does it falter, even then? By far the biggest addition to Destiny's sandbox with this expansion was the new subclass, Strand, and oh boy does it take up a lot of this expansion. It's the main focus of the story to its detriment, but we'll get to that later. Many of Lightfall's levels and encounters revolve around it, but how's the subclass just on its own? Well, audio-visually it's excellent, as is usually the case for Destiny. The sound design sounds a lot like rope or string being wrapped around, which matches with how the subclass looks and plays, but it also has this liquidity to it that makes it feel very warped and intangible, as if at the slightest mistake it could slip through your fingers, which makes it feel more like the extra reality Bungie wanted. And the sounds overall feel very similar to Deep Sight from the Witch Queen, which makes it feel at home as a darkness power. On the visual side, the saturated green coloration works really well and makes it look distinct from the rest of the game, which usually uses a more muted shade of green. The look of the abilities makes it appear like a floating current, which ties into its lore, and the effects when you defeat enemies are very satisfying and look as if you are untangling them from reality. And when you summon the grapple ability, it does look as if you are summoning something from another reality. My props to the audio and art teams for making the subclass look and sound distinct from the subclasses that came before while still being interesting. As for the gameplay with Strand, well, it was important that they get it right because Strand introduces possibly the most significant gameplay change to Destiny yet, the grappling hook. Grappling hooks are an extremely significant gameplay addition. The grapple fundamentally changes the pace of play and makes movement feel faster and more dynamic, something I was actually worried about. Despite what fans may say, the combat loop of Destiny isn't actually the fastest thing in the world. It's not slow, but a lot of it does come down to holding down the left trigger, or right click if you're on MNK, and shooting your opponents in the head. I was hoping that the addition of Strand would bring some much needed mobility to Destiny to make the gameplay loop fresh again. Thankfully, I think the gameplay team at Bungie did a pretty good job of integrating Strand into the core gameplay loop. The grappling hook is incredibly responsive and utilizes its unique ability to grapple into thin air to its benefit, allowing the player to grapple across wide open areas without having to anchor onto a thin piece of tree or something. And while difficult to control once you get it right, it is really fun. This is enhanced by the grapple melee mechanic, which adds a bit of impact to finishing a grapple. Not only does it sound really good to land one, but it also does a metric ton of damage to enemies around you in a relatively wide radius, making it an effective tool for crowd control. Tangles also enhance this new loop by allowing the player to engage with environmental objects that they create to mix up the core gameplay loop. When you kill enemies with Strand damage, a cluster creates these balls of energy, called Tangles, which you can then use as bombs to kill more enemies or even to use as anchor points for your grapple. This adds an element of aggressive counterplay to the subclass dynamic, as now not only are you plotting your next move with Strand as you activate your melee ability or grapple, but also about the move after that and where you can throw the Tangle to maximize damage. And that's just one mechanic. There are also others with different effects that make using Strand such a treat. Other subclasses have dabbled in additional effects to enemies and to environments, like how stasis freezes people, but nothing this varied, fun, and gameplay defining. From a gameplay perspective, this might be my new favorite subclass, and even though I really don't want to go back and replay this campaign again, as I get more familiar with Strand, it does sort of make me want to do it again on my Warlock, especially since the Warlock super looks fucking sweet. So in conclusion, Strand is a pretty substantial improvement to the gameplay of Destiny. It's fun, engaging, and well designed, and pushes the core combat loop forward in an interesting way. It's easily the best part of this expansion. Speaking of... When Bungie revealed the trailer for Lightfall, it was vastly different from what everyone was expecting in terms of tone and aesthetics. Instead of the dark and apocalyptic tone and art direction everyone was expecting, Bungie introduced a new setting in Neptune called Neomuna, which borrowed from 80s sci-fi like Blade Runner. Now, I like this aesthetic choice in theory. I love Blade Runner, and I thought this new environment with the active siege by Callus, who is now a disciple of the Witness, would create a neat urban warfare setting in this cyberpunk-inspired city, which is something I've never seen before. And with the urban look combined with the Literal War Zone, I thought it might be high time to add depth to the new destination that is added with each expansion. I hesitate to call these locations open worlds, because if I did count Destiny 2 as an open world game, it would be the worst open world game I've ever played. Yes, that includes Halo Infinite, a game that, while enjoyable on a moment-to-moment level, broad scale is the biggest joke of an open world for a AAA game, but even that looks like an Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild in comparison to Destiny 2's annoyingly large, empty destinations. These aren't open worlds, they're massively drawn out MMO spaces like you'd see in World of Warcraft, with simple, menial tasks and public events to do when you're just hanging around. But in practice, these activities are so basic and enemy numbers so minimal that it makes the locations feel like empty landscapes that, while pretty, end up feeling forgettable because there isn't any intrigue. That's part of the reason I don't really like Beyond Light, because the mission design forces us to engage with the empty, boring space that is Europa to do said menial tasks as part of the campaign experience. You can't tell me that an entire mission dedicated to traveling around Europa and activating communication towers by just standing there for a minute and that being the entirety of the mission is good mission design. It's just not going to happen. I hope the denser space of a city like Neomuna would clump these activities closer together and allow Bungie to add secrets and hidden areas that could give the location more depth and intrigue. This did not happen. Now, the art direction of Neomuna is gorgeous. As is always the case, the art teams at Bungie did a really good job of creating a nice atmosphere. It was ethereal, with the stunning blue weather patterns of the Neptune skybox, effectively synced with the neon signs and lights of the city, sufficiently cyberpunk with the towering architecture, and it even very much looks like a war zone with Callus's ship causing a shift in terrain elevation where it landed. It all creates a nice atmosphere and an interesting environment just to look at. The music team also did an incredible job with the score for this expansion, combining cyberpunk-esque synth with 80s-style action tracks, with a hint of melancholic choir and orchestra for the darkness, as well as the typical low tones of the Cabal, perfectly meshing these tones together to create a soundscape that accomplishes the 80s synth action movie vibe, while simultaneously being the only thing in this campaign that manages to keep the energy up. However, in spite of the prowess on display by the musicians and art teams, it seems the world design doesn't match up with the high quality bar of the art and music. Again, my hope was that the denser nature of the environment would encourage world designers to take a more interesting approach to public events. In some ways, progress has been made, enemy density has increased, there are more patrols, and this unique public event thing in which you can call a horde of enemies to defeat within a time limit, in addition to the usual public events. Also in addition to the usual lost sectors. All of this makes it seem like progress has been made, however the addition of more stuff to do does not an interesting location make. The lost sectors are usually the most interesting part of these locations, and Bungie even improved on them for Lightfall. They are more visually interesting, longer, and more challenging with greater enemy density. However, in Neomuna, there are only a total of 3 lost sectors. Now that's not less than previous expansions, but not being less isn't a compliment. I wanted Neomuna to expand on what worked about these destinations and make an area I'd actually want to spend time in. All these needless patrols and public events are so boring. They don't add anything to the world, they're just chores to grind for the location gear. If I could sacrifice these extra public events they added in exchange for more curated mini levels like the Lost Sectors, I would in a heartbeat. Neomuna isn't the game-changing location I wanted it to be, and maybe I was setting myself up for failure by believing Bungie would improve their world design, but I really hoped the urban design of Neomuna would discourage this kind of design and encourage Bungie to add more to make the world feel lived in. It's not empty in the way some people were saying. The more contained spaces and more interesting art direction make it a location I'd sooner visit than, say, the vast, monotonous light blues of Europa, but it's certainly not the location I could see myself losing in the way I'd hoped, or in the way of any other open world game. It's mostly just tedious. Just like the... This part is going to be the shortest because it's just a list of quality of life features added to Lightfall and several accompanying bugs. The biggest feature is the addition of loadouts, which I would find useful if I ever changed my build. However, that loadout system doesn't contain any customization features and is really rigid. Again, I'm sure it's better for people who actually change their builds, but not for me. It's way too stringent to be usable in that way and doesn't solve the actual problem with Destiny 2 armor management, that being that the menus, which despite looking non-threatening on paper, are not very intuitive. In fact, it adds confusion because the loadout system is really confusing and also unintuitive. I saw some people saying that the simplification of build and weapon crafting made it more uninteresting, which is a fair criticism, especially as I learn what those systems are. I like this game, but I'm still very new to it, and I don't know how all the systems work. In terms of bugs, there was this really distracting one in the Karate Kid training montage where Osiris just stops existing in a perceptible way, and a host of server issues. I got contacting Destiny 2 servers every 15 minutes, and my friend got a glitch wherein the game became unplayable because they couldn't use their weapons because the server was still loading them, a glitch I was able to replicate in the post-Lightfall content. In addition, the bounty system and seasonal vendor-specific engrams are still convoluted as hell. This expansion didn't so much as fix quality of life updates, but make it slightly less annoying in ways that don't matter to the way I play the game and are only relevant to the hardcore people. So now that we've gotten that boring stuff out of the way, let's talk about how inconsistent the level design is. So now it's time to talk about the level design, which contains some of the widest differences in quality in the whole expansion. Everything I've talked about before has either been kinda disappointing to extremely fun, but none of it is atrociously bad or a step back for Destiny. It's these last two pillars, those being level design and story, where I feel Bungie dropped the ball. Now, I hold Bungie's level design to very high standards, not because of anything in Destiny, but because of what came before, in Halo. Halo 3 and Halo Reach have some of my favorite level design in any game ever and are the main reason why I love those games and even one of the best aspects of the original Halo, Combat Evolved. These levels are vast and open and allow the player to engage with them in an interesting way. Sure, they are curated to some extent, but the use of the sandbox in combination with the interesting enemy and level design make for challenging and interesting combat scenarios that Destiny hasn't really had in my experience. Levels often feel undercooked and highly curated. Obviously, the Bungie that makes Destiny is not the same Bungie that made Halo, with many of them going off to work on Halo again at 343, which is part of the reason I still enjoy the newer Halos to some extent, at least. But I feel like a studio with such memorable level design under their belt would look at their own legacy and take inspiration for their projects going forward. It's not like Destiny could be incapable of creating level design similar to that of a Halo game, with Destiny's style of gameplay being both movement and precision oriented and a focus on high enemy density. Honestly, it may be even more suited to that style of level design than Halo was, and it would also prompt Bungie to add more interesting enemies, which they did, but we'll get back to that. Witch Queen found a good marriage between the sandbox of a Halo level with the more curated style of Destiny missions, with 8 well-paced levels that utilized open areas with unique enemy gimmicks that encouraged the player to work around odd designs. Witch Queen didn't embrace Halo-style level design, it just perfected Destiny's, and is the main reason, even more so than the story, why that campaign is so memorable and replayable for me. Meanwhile, Lightfall doesn't have that nice mesh, but instead swings wildly from mission to mission, with some missions being extremely wide and open like a Halo level, and others being extremely boxed in and frustrating beyond all belief. The open levels like Downfall or the second half of the opening mission, First Contact, are really fun. The high enemy density and wide spaces lead to some tense encounters that force the player to move around, which is good in an FPS game, especially a single player one. Forcing the player to engage with the movement system is always going to be more interesting than having them shoot at hordes of enemies with their precision SMG or sniper rifle. In the same spirit, Bungie also introduced the best enemy type that they've ever done for this game in this expansion. The Tormentors. They are extremely challenging, but it's a good kind of challenge like what you'd see in a Dark Souls game. They move in an incredibly unpredictable way and are extremely aggressive, forcing the player to keep on their toes and try and gain distance from them so they can land their precision hits. In addition, many of their attacks can also launch the player a fair distance away, possibly a bug, but I say they should keep it in, as it allows the player a bit of range to get a few hits in or run away if they so choose. These guys are really fun and engaging to fight, and I didn't mind their repetition. They were the most fun parts of the missions, and it made sense from a lore perspective that the Witness would use them, given how important the Veil is to its plans. Overall, there's a lot of good here, with many steps taken to make the mission design and gameplay more fun and dynamic. However, with that experimentation also comes the troughs of Bungie's level design. For instance, the mission Breakneck has you fighting Vex in a tight, constrained area with very little room to maneuver or find cover. This mission sucks. However, that isn't where most of my problems with Lightfall's mission design come from. Most of my criticism is how the campaign gameplay handles Strand. Okay, time for some context here. Many streamers mention how they felt that Strand was a letdown after the campaign ended, but perhaps my biggest hot take on this expansion is that I actually have the opposite opinion. I found Strand to be exponentially more fun post-campaign than during the campaign because without the curator missions attached, and with some aspects and fragments unlocked afterward of course, I actually felt like I had the freedom to experiment. The campaign missions that utilize Strand feel way too curated to make it feel like a fun subclass that I can play my way. But instead, I have to play in the developer's way, which is often boring because of the superpowered nature of Strand during the campaign, and the insistence by the level designers of focusing a bunch of encounters around it, which can make these encounters feel airless to play. There's a similar problem in Beyond Light. For instance, at the end of the campaign when you fight Aramis, the game gives you a supercharged version of Stasis to just wail on her with, trivializing the fight, which drains all the excitement and weight out of actually fighting her. This is the main villain of the campaign, one of the most important Elixir characters, and her boss fight is a pushover. The problem isn't quite as bad here. Some of the bosses are really well designed and fit the enhanced Strand power. However, others are extremely trivial with Strand, and others still are annoying as fuck with Strand. Let's take a look at two boss fights that illustrate both the problem and the solution. First, the good boss fight, the Callous boss fight. The boss fight itself represents the two extremes. In the first phase, he wields a cannon and shoots at you as you wing around in the circular arena. This is a little tedious as it basically becomes a game of Ring Around the Rosie, where you just swing around the circle, periodically doing damage, and he has a lot of health. A lot. So it becomes, tedious, especially as a pair of tormentors will torment you. In the second phase, he goes full melee and the Veil traps you in a more confined area with a bunch of Strand grapple points for you to swing onto. You basically have to stay in the air the entire time to avoid Callous, who, now a souped up gladiator, is extremely aggressive and attacks you any chance he gets, so you have to kite him around and deal damage whenever you can. However, you also have to juggle killing ads for special and heavy ammo, which are going to be your most effective weapons against him. This fight is intense, fun, and you get to feel even more like Spider-Man than you did in the first part. I guess my main wish is that we get a checkpoint between the two phases, as they are entirely different boss fights. But I also like both Rykard and Malenia from Elden Ring, who also have two distinct phases with no pause between them. In retrospect, I actually kind of like this boss. I think the first phase is a little too tedious and takes too much time, but the second phase makes it all worth it. In contrast, the final boss of On the Verge, also a Strand-focused gimmick fight, who, unlike Callous, is just really boring. He's a big robot you just hit a few times with Strand, who stands around in an open area waiting for you to wail on him, occasionally going immune and forcing you to travel a mile to his little friends you have to kill before you go back to wailing at him with your grapple melees. This is an example of how Strand can make the encounter worse. If I didn't use it here, the encounter would have been stronger for it because of the lack of mobility, and extremely powerful melee offense options would have kept me on my toes more in the open area. In contrast, the Callous boss fight prevents you from using those extremely powerful Strand abilities because Callous is so aggressive that he will one-shot you if you get too close. So, on one hand, you have a boss encounter where Strand was taken into account in an effective way with an arena that actually felt fun to navigate with aggressive enemies whom it was fun to kite, but you also have mindless, trivial, forgettable bosses that you only have to hit like 5 times with a super before they die. And then there's the boss fight at the end of the second to last mission, which has an extremely annoying arena, but much the same level of triviality. The arena is too cramped and annoying with the vast number of ads thrown onto it, and the game sabotages you for using Strand and the grapple with a massive firewall that will kill you if you stand too close. This is supposed to be the mission where we master Strand, and yet it actively felt as if the game punished me for doing so. You see what I mean about inconsistency? The sheer variance in the challenge and fun between the levels leads to the campaign not doing a good job of convincing the player that Strand is fun, which leads to them not using it, which can make some of the boss fights less fun. It's not that these missions aren't well designed overall, some of them are genuinely really fun and dynamic, but the way Strand causes many of these missions to be either trivialized or made annoying leads to extremely inconsistent quality in these missions, which leads to some players finding it really fun and others finding it quite tedious. As for me, I'm somewhere in the middle, which is similar to my feelings on So the story is what most people are talking about when it comes to their disappointment with this expansion, to the point where some were saying it was overblown to call the entire expansion bad just because the story was disappointing. Now, I've already gone over why I think other parts of this expansion are also disappointing, but the story is definitely the part that leaves me the most wanting. What's annoying is that the issue with Lightfall's story isn't even really a writing issue, or at least not mostly. The issue is that good writing is structured in such a sloppy and strange way for what is supposed to be the penultimate expansion for Destiny 2. This is supposed to be the Infinity War for this franchise, and yet the story feels so laid back. The stakes feel really low, which isn't the case. The stakes are higher than they've ever been, and yet I don't feel that sense of urgency that this story was supposed to convey. This is really annoying because it dampens what are otherwise some really interesting writing choices. For instance, I like the conversations between Callus and the Witness. They finally fleshed out the Witness a little bit and made it feel like an actual threat by having it intimidate Callus, who is trying to control the situation but is clearly out of his league. I especially like the conversation between the two of them in Callus's dream, where the Witness finally snaps and Callus shits his pants. The little snarl after it says, "Secure the veil," makes it feel like the Witness is thinking, okay, I've had enough of this clown, let's just get this done. The voice acting is, as usual, also really solid. It feels a little like a cheesy action movie, but it works, and that's what Bungie wanted anyway, so I'll allow it. Another thing I really liked is the character Nimbus, the first non-binary character in Destiny. I was initially really worried about this character given the way Bungie built them.
They're so boisterous and fun-loving and a little smug, but super confident in their abilities.
I usually hate this archetype of an annoying rookie character who is smug and dismissive of our character, but Nimbus doesn't come across like that at all to me. Instead, the writers leaned more into the rookie angle, having them be boisterous, confident, and wanting to run headfirst into danger, while also having a little bit of character development in the second half after, spoilers, Rohan is dead, which we'll get into. But they also have wisdom and fun to add to our central cast, and they act as a nice foil for Osiris, who is far more stuck up and needs to loosen up a little. Honestly, they're just really fun. They provide a nice bit of levity to the story that, while having the tone and pacing of a fun action movie, is still treated by the other characters as a very serious narrative. They're really the only character that feels at home in this story. And even if I don't like that the story is focused on Strand, what they did as far as writing Strand into the lore and as a part of Osiris' character arc is really neat. Osiris is still torn up about the death of his ghost Sagira and the Witch Queen, and is in go 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 mode in order to feel like he's not useless. And what Strand teaches him is that he needs to calm down and take a step back, man. The whole point of Strand is to go with the flow and look at things from the bigger picture. Now you might say this is a bad theme for a story like Lightfall, but if you would allow me to put on my English teacher's hat and view this as a parallel for the way people often get stressed as deadlines approach, it actually kind of works. I myself have often found that the best way to mitigate stress from that sort of thing is to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Sure, it is the end of the world, but the lighter tone serves the theme really well, or at least it does in theory. Problem is that in spite of the campaign clearly wanting to tell this story of Osiris and your journey to discovering Strand, it's one of the two major plot lines, and that other plot line doesn't support the story the Strand plot line is trying to tell, because at the end of the day, in spite of the main theme being about taking a more big picture approach and going with the flow rather than trying to brute force and control the situation, this is still the penultimate Destiny 2 expansion, and as such, we still had to lose in the end. The plotline about Callus trying to get the Veil and the urgency that comes with that is so at odds with the laid-back anime training arc-esque nature of the Strand storyline that it leads to the campaign fluctuating between being a fun romp with characters we like and trying to be incredibly dramatic and high stakes. In the mission Downfall, we infiltrate Callus's ship to stop him from getting this artifact that will help him secure the Veil. Fail, and then get rescued by Keitel in a very dramatic chase scene that has us racing out of Callus's ship to a timer. This mission is tense and dramatic as Keitel and Callus finally exchange a dialogue with each other, but then after that mission, which is spent building up dramatic tension to get us ready for the drama of the upcoming story, the energy dives off a cliff and all the tension is completely gone, and we're back to playing with Strand and helping Cloud Strider Rohan with his chores. We spend so much time exploring Strand with Osiris that it leads to other story elements like Rohan and the conflict between Callus and Keitel being underdeveloped, the former of which comes to a head when Rohan dies in the mission No Time Left, which admittedly is a fun mission. I like blowing stuff up with a tank, but Rohan's dramatic sacrifice honestly fell completely flat for me. I just didn't care about his character enough to really be sad when he died. Even as Nimbus mourned him in their jokey kind of way, it still wasn't enough to bring me to care. This is what happens when you spend too much time dicking around with a fun Spider-Man subclass and establishing a lighter tone. It means that all the dramatic moments you then want to include fall flat because the energy isn't high enough and the tone not dark enough to support them, leading to these moments being robbed of their dramatic weight. Same with the ending, which felt extremely anticlimactic to me. The Witness establishes a link to the Veil, opens a triangle portal and goes inside the Traveler, and that's it. It's just there now. There's a triangle and the Witness is inside of it. The music and post-ending dialogue from Zavala try and make the player feel like we've lost, but the tone throughout the campaign is still really jovial. And the way Zavala speaks makes it feel like less of a loss than it is. And because the Traveler's still in the sky, because our ghosts are still functioning, and because none of the important characters we care about died, it leaves this ending not really feeling like that much of a loss. There are no consequences at the end of the campaign, at least none that I can tell. It's a complete wet fart of an ending. And then there's the Veil, which I'm not going to comment too much on because everyone has already harped on about it, but I will give it my 2 cents. I can accept that Osiris does not care what the Veil is, and just knows that the Witness cannot have it. If that's the reason he's not questioning what it is, That is fine. But the thing is, he never says that outright. He and the Cloudstriders all act like they know what it is and like we're the only ones left out of the loop. And then we never learn what it is. Now you could argue that yeah, Bungie will explain it later, it's a mystery. But the story doesn't treat it like it's a mystery. We're just treated like we should already know what it is and it serves its function in the plot at the end. We're not even given any hints as to why the Veil might be important in the future, at least none that are significant enough for me to care. So even beyond just not knowing, the story doesn't convince me that I should want to know what the Veil is. Also, this is Destiny 2 Lightfall. I get wanting a bit of filler before the final shape so you have more time to develop it, but if you're going to do that, you should take this opportunity to explain the answers to questions we still don't have the answers to that may be important to know going into the finale. Like what the Veil is! These aren't writing flaws, the character dynamics are all well written and the themes are certainly interesting, and I even don't mind the angle they decided to tackle the story with. These are structural and tonal issues that mess up and muddle good writing on display. The tone and pacing are at war with themselves, constantly trying to figure out how intense and dark the story should be, fluctuating between being a high-stakes story about Callus seizing the Veil, and a chill anime trading arc where we learn about the fun Spider-Man abilities, and it just robs the emotional beats of all of their dramatic weight. And you want to know the funniest part? If the Strand plot had been cut out and made into a seasonal story, it would have been so much better, because it would have meant more time to develop the Strand story and a more laid-back pace and tone that comes with this seasonal model. The format of the typical seasonal story would have been perfect for this kind of narrative. But of course, we need to introduce the big new subclass in a big yearly expansion story, just like Beyond Light, which also had a problem integrating its subclass into the main story. It makes me hope they don't introduce a new subclass in the final shape, or at least, if they are, have it be unlocked in an unobtrusive side quest or seasonal story that doesn't impact the main campaign. Then just make the campaign a focused and high-stakes story about stopping the Witness, more in the vein of the Witch Queen. As is, this story is really confused about what it's trying to be, and it makes everything muddled narratively. There's a lot of good in here, but it's all covered in the rotting corpse of the structural and tonal issues that overshadow any and all interesting plot or character development. So Lightfall was a disappointment. Well, that's irritating. I would be lying if I said my trust was not a bit shaken after finishing this campaign. It's not like Destiny hasn't had bad campaigns in the past. In fact, many of them have had the same problems. But that's the thing. The fact that these problems are back and rearing their ugly heads is concerning, especially after Bungie solidified that they had learned from their mistakes with the tight pacing and balanced gameplay of the Witch Queen. Lightfall feels so sloppy in comparison. However, I don't think it's necessarily indicative of where we're headed. Leakers have pointed out the possibility that what is now the final shape was originally Lightfall, and that the Lightfall campaign was intended to be filler to allow more development time for the final shape. Now, whether or not this is true, Bungie still should have taken advantage of the filler nature of this expansion to answer lore questions and set up the final shape in a compelling way. And they definitely shouldn't have marketed it in such a deceptive way, but hopefully it means that the finale of the Light and Dark saga won't be tainted by the same problems. All Bungie has to do now is address the numerous plot holes and unaddressed character plot lines in the game through the seasonal story throughout the next year, and use that to truly set up the final shape in a compelling way. Then ride that compelling setup with a banger finale to the current Destiny story. And thankfully, it does seem that that may be possible. I checked out the first week of Season of Defiance and found it to still have the usual good writing Bungie has been showcasing for the past year or two. Destiny 2 Lightfall was a disappointment, and we should be skeptical of future Destiny stories going forward. But enough was good about it to keep me interested in this franchise, and it certainly doesn't mean certain doom for Destiny. Bungie can still stick the landing if they have the talent and foresight to manage it. But I swear to God, if Final Shape is disappointing, I'm going back to Halo Infinite.